Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. Just a reminder that our organization, Just and Sinner, is supported by donors, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We are actually really looking for some donations. If you have any extra funds for any reason at this point and are looking for a place to donate them, we would ask you to really consider it, because there are a number of projects that we have that we are looking for funding for. Just to give you an update, I've been doing this as for my full-time job. And I'm also working for, our seminary part-time, but this is the main gig that pays my bills here. In terms of where we are with fundraising with our organization, we basically have just enough to pay my salary. I'm not paying myself a lot, really not. We live in New York State, and the amount I'm paying is very low for where we are. But we really need funding to pay for a lot of other things. I obviously have the work that I need to get done, but we're looking for, editors. We have an editor, and we also have a number of projects that really need editing, book projects and other things. And we're just looking for the extra funding to get those things done. So ideally, we really would like to have a couple other positions on staff here part-time. One would be to really actually pay a part-time editor to have regular work, especially for all of the original publications that we have coming out. We've got a lot of those on the docket that we're working on, really exciting stuff. But also we are looking for someone to handle a lot of the financial issues and background and all of that stuff, which is certainly not my area. So that's what we're looking for right now. So I'm just asking you to at least consider it, prayerfully consider it. If you want to help us out, justinsinner.org, go to our donate page there. You could sign up through Patreon and get access to different videos and rewards of different kinds there. So anyway, I just want to put that out there before I get to the topic of the podcast. One other thing that I want to mention is that we're set to have a book release of our book, Petrus Naxkow's Articles of Faith at the Evangelical Lutheran Church. Excellent book that I've been working on for quite some time to get this new edition out. And, I've been excited about it and have mentioned it. So I've had quite a few people say, where's the book? Because I've looked for it on, the 15th when it was the release date, and it's not on Amazon yet. Well, let me just explain what's going on there. First of all, you can get the Kindle edition. It's been up there. So if you want the ebook, it is available now. You can find it there. But the paperback edition is not yet there. It's not because it was not completed, but Amazon is, I think, confused about the fact that we are putting out a book that is a new edition that is based on a public domain translation, but is thoroughly revised. And they seem to think that it's public domain, and also are not sure if it's something that can be copyrighted because it's close to the public domain translation. And so there's a bit of a backup there. So I'm hoping that this will be resolved as soon as possible. I will post it on the JS Publishing website as well as on social media, and I'll send out an email as well. If you want to sign up for our email list to get updates about those kind of things, go to justinsinner.org. And so keep an eye out for that. I am excited. It's coming. We're just trying to resolve this issue with Amazon, which is the reason why it's not currently showing up there. But if you have Kindle and that's your preferred way of reading, you can just get it that way. It's available now. So, all right. With all of that, I want to get into the topic of the program today. And that is, we're going to be talking about some cultural issues. And when I say that, I don't mean that I'm going to be getting into specific political debates or something like that today. But what I'm going to be dealing with is a book that was recently released by Carl Trueman that I think is very helpful to understand the situation that we are in today. And, as I've said before, I'm not a politician. I'm not a political commentator. I have no desire to be a political commentator whatsoever. However, there are a lot of really important issues that we do have to discuss, speaking about theology and how theology relates to our current culture and our current society and our current cultural norms. And it is incumbent upon the church to respond to a lot of those issues. not to have specific stances on which candidates you should vote for, or to have stances on what policies about economics or anything else that we should have. I don't believe that that's the business of the church. But dealing with our current cultural moment and what are just the current ideologies that fuel a lot of our discussion today is really essential. It's really essential, I think, for all of us. And when we think about a lot of the current conversations, those don't really happen, arguments in in our world today, just politically from various sides, what we tend to do is focus on the symptom rather than the problem itself. So we kind of take a lot of our debates or arguments issue by issue, because that's what we see, and we see shifts in our day. But to really grasp what's gone on in our culture and our society, ideologically over many centuries, what we need to do is understand the kind of philosophical shifts that have happened. And really, we can go back to even the kind of pre-Reformation era to see some philosophical shifts and how those things have changed the way we look at the world around us, the way we look at ourselves. And so in order to really understand our current cultural moment, I think the unfortunate thing in a lot of our kind of popular level arguments about politics, especially in an American context, your Republican Democrat arguments, we're not getting to what are the root issues at all. And oftentimes we are all arguing with one another on the basis of false philosophical claims that everyone accepts. What we may speak about as a kind of expressive individualism, and we'll talk about this, really underlies a lot of the arguments that we have. And I think that this, we think of ourselves as individuals. We think of authenticity in terms of self-expression and doing what we want to do rather than conforming to what our culture says we should do, cultural norms, these kinds of things. And this is not something that is just adopted by the progressive left. I think that this stands behind, for example, a lot of the arguments that have gone on since the lockdowns about the wearing of masks. Now, I'm not making a statement one way or another about the usefulness of masks or what they do or what the policy should be. Like, yeah, you can all argue about that. It's not my field, and I don't believe that I am, have a expertise in virology and those kinds of things just because I have an expertise in a totally unrelated field. So I'm not going to make those comments, and everybody seems to have a very adamant opinion about these questions. But the only reason I'm bringing this up is to say that from those who are have been really opposed to mask mandates, just listening to the kind of language that is used in their argumentation, so more from the Republican side, which tends to be the case today, the language of, you can't impose upon my rights and force me to do something I don't want to do. I don't want to wear a mask, so I don't have to do it. And what I think is important to understand is that line of argumentation and the place that it's coming from is a place of expressive individualism. It is coming from an inherent kind of way of looking at ourselves and looking at the world and looking at values that does develop through modernism in the modern era. It is where we are in the 21st century. So my point in bringing that up is just to say that it does form how both sides of the political aisles think about issues, because we see that kind of argumentation from the progressive left on gender issues and gender expression, but then we see similar kinds of argumentation from the right as well when we're speaking about what the government can coerce us to do or not coerce us to do. The arguments against that largely do come from a place of individual freedom and self-expression and those kinds of things. So what I want to do is take a look at Carl Trueman's recent book and just discuss some of the ideas in there, which I think are really, really helpful for us to understand our cultural moment today. I will tell you, I'm working on a book right now. I kind of have an outline of this and I've started writing it. And I know I'm always working on I'm working on 4 book projects at the same time. So I don't know. I kind of bounce all over the place. But anyway, this is a project that I'm working on, which is a study of truth, goodness, and beauty, these 3 transcendentals. And I'm talking about what those ideas are, the approach to truth, goodness, and beauty in classical thought, and how those ideas have been, first of all, divorced from one another, and then lost in our modern society, and then kind of how to recapture that, or how to think about those questions as Christians. And I think a large part of my argument is that what happened in the Enlightenment is we had this kind of rupture between truth on the one hand and then goodness and beauty, right? Truth is objective, goodness and beauty is these subjective personal opinion kind of things, and truth is then relegated to the realm purely of scientific experimentation, and you get all sorts of problems that are flowing out of that. So I think it's interesting when you see all these kind of Enlightenment thinkers like Richard Dawkins now fighting very much against what has gone on with the adoption of various critical theories and postmodern theories today. But really the rupture, I think, occurred much earlier than that. I think in some ways this is a necessity that things are going to end up this way when you separate truth, goodness, and beauty from one another. So, but that's, we'll kind of save that first, then we get into it a little bit today. But I'm working on that particular work. So anyway, in preparing for that, I've been doing quite a bit of reading, and on that reading list was Carl Trueman's recent book. It's called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. If you have not read this book, it came out last year, so it's still pretty recent. If you've not read this book, I would recommend that you read it. I endorse the book wholeheartedly. That doesn't mean I agree with every single conclusion that is in there, by the way. But for the most part, I think it is an extremely helpful summary of how we got to where we are today. Trueman's work is not in and of itself a particularly original work, in that it's not like he's coming up with a lot of his own ideas. What he's really doing is synthesizing the work of a lot of other authors. He's definitely incorporating them into a Christian framework, though even as a non-Christian, you could follow his argument very well and still kind of resonate with a lot of what he's saying. So he synthesizes a lot of ideas of a lot of others very well and popularizes them. Now, that doesn't mean that this is a particularly easy read. If you aren't one that's that well acquainted with philosophy, you just may have to read it slowly. So I understand that some people have said this is a difficult read, and yeah, it's not going to be a breeze. There's a lot of information packed in here in a pretty small space, so take your time reading it. It's definitely one of those books that you can't just it's not an easy read. But nonetheless, the language is very accessible. It's very easy to understand the ideas that are in much larger books that are much more difficult to read if you find them elsewhere. So Truman popularizes that. He makes it accessible. Again, that doesn't mean it's extremely easy to read, but anyone should be able to get through the arguments. You just may have to take your time because there's so much to unpack here. So highly recommend the book. What I'm going to be doing is just going through some of the major ideas that Truman unpacks in this book here and explaining them. This is not meant to be a replacement for the book or to say, just listen to my exposition of some of these ideas. I recommend reading the book, and this is an endorsement of that work. Highly, highly recommended. And it's been endorsed by all sorts of people. It has been on a lot of kind of best books of 2020 lists that I've read. And I saw recently that, Ben Shapiro gave a endorsement of the book on Twitter, said that it was, like the book of our age that everyone needs to read. If you're not a fan of Ben Shapiro, don't let that turn you off from this work. It doesn't have the kind of like polemics that you expect in someone like a Ben Shapiro. It really is not that polemical at all, which is what I really liked about the book, is what Truman does is just kind of he's really just asking the question, how do we get to where we are today? And in the very beginning of the book, he introduces that with a particular question, which is a relevant cultural concern today that stands behind a lot of our discussion, which is, he says, take a statement, I am a man trapped inside a woman's body. To a modern audience, at least in a modern Western context, that statement makes sense. For audiences of a long time ago, for individuals of, even 100 years ago, that statement would be incoherent. It would make no sense. People wouldn't know what you were talking about. So the question that he raises is, ideologically, what has shifted so that this idea makes sense? Now, as you look at especially the gender issues and how the rhetoric surrounding that and language of transphobia and this kind of demonizing language of anyone with a different opinion. Now with the point that Ryan Anderson's wonderful book on the issue, When Harry Became Sally. I recommend the book, by the way. I thought it was an excellent treatment. I'm not the biggest fan of the title of the book, but I do think that the book actually deals quite well and with a bit of nuance on the subject. It's not as kind of inflammatory as, well, it's being said to be by those who are censoring the book. I thought it was very careful, very thoughtful, it engaged with the subject very well. I think Ryan Anderson generally deals with these issues very well, with a lot of these kinds of moral issues. Definitely a student of Robert George. You can see the influence there in many ways. And I think he, and Robert George, I've always admired in the way that he addresses a lot of these issues of things like natural law. He does it with grace and with logical rigor as well, and not in a overly polemical, rhetorically infused kind of, I don't know, the kind of rhetoric that you get at a lot of YouTube commentators, which, is what it is. That works for like a popular level audience, but and I understand why people like that kind of stuff, but it's certainly not going to, I think, provide the kind of the ideological background that we need that's going to take place in a dispassionate academic debate, which again doesn't really exist in our culture today. So that's not really even allowed in our culture today to do that. You can't be dispassionate about anything. Not that you shouldn't believe firmly in what you're saying, but you should be able to set forth an argument without the kind of heated rhetoric necessarily that's going on, and just deal with the issues and the questions, logically, philosophically, medically, and things like that. Anyway, so when we look at how fast the culture has shifted on, and particularly the gender issue, and how quickly opposing views have been demonized, we may say, like, what in the world happened, in the last 20 years? Because ideologically, there's been an insane shift in the last 20 years. The rhetoric of, for example, many on the left, not all on the left, but for many on the left, if you take a position that was the position of all major Democratic, say, presidential candidates, 20 years ago, people with those same positions today would be considered right-wing extremists, which is just, it's so odd how this shift has occurred so quickly and how the rhetoric has shifted so quickly. So we may think like, well, society's just changing so fast. But what Truman does is says, look, it seems fast, and it seems like these ideas come out of nowhere, but really there is a long kind of historical pedigree of where these things came from, right? Logically, there have been major shifts. So let's kind of look at what has changed, what has caused this, and we can go back many centuries. Now, what a lot of people want to do, especially a lot of Christians, is go back to the sexual revolution of the 1960s. Rightly so, because that was a huge cultural moment and cultural shift that certainly played a very significant role in terms of how we get here today. But the problem is then when people grab onto that and say, well, if only we could go back to the 1950s, here's like this golden era where society was so much better, not to mention the, horrible racial issues that were part of society back then. We tend to forget that stuff, but generally, yeah, you got the Leave It to Beaver stuff, and here's where we had, the biblical traditional values. Well, we can't do that. And I think what Truman does well in this work is say, we're not saying there's this golden age we need to go back to before this era or that era. We're in the age we're in, and we need to move forward. So let's not kind of idealize some age of the past. Well, like you see in a lot of, the trad Catholics trying to say like, well, back, when, at Vatican I, we got to go back to that age, because when the Pope had this much influence on society, things were much better. A pre-Reformation era, or the era of the Council of Trent or something. Or you look at Anglo-Catholicism, which kind of does the same thing. So it's very easy for us to always just idealize this period in history and say, let's go back to that. Or the Reformed may say, let's go back to the Puritans, let's go back to that era. And so it's not where we are. And those eras had plenty of their own issues. They're not our issues today, but they had lots of their own issues. So I don't think we want to be where we were in the 1950s on certain issues, especially racial issues. Yeah, we don't want to go pre-civil rights movement and say, oh, that was an ideal society. It wasn't. Part of the problem of the whole phrase that was kind of at front and center of Donald Trump's campaign, "Make America Great Again." Well, when was it great, and what do you mean, right? Because the idea is there must have been a better age. Well, what was that age? What are we going back to? And it's not always clear. So I think, well, we can say these are things that were great in the past and better in the past in certain ways, and we can recapture those. What we can't do is just idealize some past age and say we have to just go back there. No, we're where we are, right? We're in the 21st century. We've got to deal with that. Let's deal with issues where we are. Let's not kind of pretend that we can just go back to some golden era in the past. Let's just wrestle with, however, how we got here and what some of the problematic things are in our culture and our society, and say what is the root of that, and then how can we address it. So that's what I think Truman does extremely well as he addresses a lot of these issues. All right, so Truman, I want to get into some of the specifics of things that he brings up in this book. Now, he's going to deal largely with two individuals. And these aren't the only two individuals. He's also going to cite Alistair McIntyre's book After Virtue, which is a great book. It's been a while since I've read it, but I enjoyed it at the time that I did read that work. But along with McIntyre, he's going to deal particularly with two figures, Charles Taylor and Philip Rieff. Now, Charles Taylor, he's going to deal with particularly one book, which is called Sources of the Self, The Making of Modern Identity, which was published in 1989. Charles Taylor is a Canadian philosopher. And what Charles Taylor is going to do is outline how we got to our view of the self today. And this is in the 1980s. So of course the view of the self even has shifted since 1989. But the basic underlying principles that led the way to, or the place that we are today, those had already been there. So then we have Philip Rieff, who is a sociologist. He lived between 1822 and 2006. And he has some interesting writing as well. Now, Rieff's work is a bit difficult to read from what I have read, and I want to really delve kind of more into his own text, many of his texts. He's got a lot of books that seem very worthwhile, but there are certain themes that Truman grabs onto in his writing as he expounds upon these ideas. So I think to kind of begin the large part of the argument that Truman is going to get into, he expounds upon this idea of what is the social imaginary, and the phrase specifically is from Charles Taylor. Now, the social imaginary is this: it's the basic ideas that form how an individual in a society thinks about themselves, how they approach the world, how they act in the world. It's kind of this catch-all term. Because when we're dealing with where culture is today, we so often look at things like, the postmodern philosophers, and we're right to do so. We can look at a Lyotard or a Derrida or these various figures that are really important for Michel Foucault, probably more foundationally than many others in terms of his view of power dynamics, that is very influential for where our culture has gone today. But when we look at these kinds of things, we think, okay, well, these are these kind of French, largely, philosophers in the academy. What does that have to do with, the average Joe, down the road from me in upstate New York? Like, what do those two things have to do with each other? This person has probably never even heard of Michel Foucault. But so, what's the relevance of what they think, and what's the connection here? Well, the social imaginary is this catch-all phrase to identify more than just what's going on in the academy. Now, when we're understanding what's going on in the academy, though, what we have to see is that the ideas that may seem abstract or unimportant, those ideas do trickle down. Okay, they do trickle down to the mainstream. Now, they don't do it through a series of academic lectures in your town square and everybody circles around and it's like, I want to hear about deconstruction. Of course, obviously not. But it does come down in different ways. Generally, that is done through the arts and through the popularization of the arts. Now, even when you're speaking about art, you could certainly talk about art as it is for the academy, or art as it is in terms of kind of high culture, or art as it influences the elite. So it's not like the average person is going to be influenced by, say, Jeff Koons or some other popular artist today, or Tracy Emin or something. As much as those artists do say actually a heck of a lot about where our culture and society is. But no, what they're gonna see is the jokes that are in their favorite comedies that they watch on TV, and the references to those things, and the rhetoric that they hear from their talking heads on TV, news anchors, or people they hear on the radio, or the kind of language they're going to see in the New York Times, articles that are posted on Facebook. So the ideas do trickle down from the academy. They do come down to the average person. Now, the average person doesn't have the background, and nor do they need to. It's not like I'm advocating for the responsibility of every individual to have some extensive knowledge of, Michel Foucault or Karl Marx or whoever. Though I do think that our educational system, if we're doing it properly, will give somewhat of a grounding in these ideas so we can think critically enough to evaluate. But those works are largely impenetrable, especially when we're talking about the postmodernists. And then when we get to like the gender theorists too, like Judith Butler. I mean, it's yes, and I've read to Judith Butler, and yes, I understood it, but it takes a lot of work, and it's purposefully obscure in terms of the language that is used. So it's not accessible. It's not supposed to be accessible, but it comes down to us in a watered down format through our media. And if you look at someone like Antonio Gramsci, who advocated, and we could talk about him later, I don't want to get too much into this, but he advocated for kind of social revolution via the media. And this is purposeful. That it's understood that if you take over the educational institutions of a society, you take over the media of a society, and you push certain ideas, that will then become the idea of the populace. That's true. I mean, that's what we're seeing. We are seeing that a particular ideological group has taken over the media in many ways. It's just a fact. I mean, it's very clear that there are certain biases, there are certain moral ideas that do control, by and large, what happens in our media and what happens in our educational institutions. And to some degree, and I've made this point before, to some degree that's kind of inevitable, because a society can't exist without values. And this is one of the problems with where liberalism has gone, is, and I'm not totally opposed to liberalism. I think there are good things there as well. But when you do get an attempt at a pure secularity within society, it just doesn't work. You have to have its values as a society. What we're seeing is that our society is now constructing its own values based on how it has identified the modern self. So it's not a valueless society. There's no such thing as a secular neutral society. It's an impossibility. We need a moral and really a religious framework to stand behind society. Anybody that tells you things like, well, we can't legislate morality via the government, those kinds of myths that we have, that we can just have this, pure secularity, it's just not true. I mean, what do you mean you can't legislate morality? Of course you can legislate morality. That's exactly what government is for. There's no sense in having law if you don't legislate morality. Because to say that, well, every individual has to have the freedom to make their own decisions and the government just is there to allow that to happen, well, you're making a moral judgment and statement. You're saying that individual liberty and freedom is good and that impinging upon others' freedoms is not good. That is a moral judgment, and you are getting the government involved in moral decision making as soon as you say that. There's no way around that. So, of course you legislate morality. The question isn't, do we legislate morality? Yeah, and politicians can argue about, well, what morality do we legislate? What things do we leave up to personal decision? And where does the government step in? Where does it not step in? And I'm not a politician, so I don't have to give you those answers. But the point is that you have to legislate morality to some degree. That's the purpose and function of government. And that often will come down to some degree to a regulation of speech. And that's what we're seeing, at least in terms of social pressure. Because you can regulate speech via social pressure not just in terms of what the government says is literally illegal to say. And John Stuart Mill deals with this. There was something I heard from Robert George recently on this, and I have my Mill here that I was reading on liberty. He has a section, and I don't have the page number in front of me, sorry. But he speaks about this, that we're speaking about coercion in terms of language and what can be said and what can't be said. We're not just talking about what the government says is illegal or will jail you for saying this or that, but it comes down to a largely social pressure. And that isn't always bad either. Like, there are certain things that are said that should be shamed by society. Does that mean we should stifle debate? No. But we could talk about where we are as a culture today in terms of those questions. But to some degree, we have to say that, yeah, there are going to be moral boundaries as a society. We have to have that. So all of that is part of what's described as this social imaginary. So we have just the ideas of the average person, the way they live their life, the way they think about themselves, the way they think about the world. A lot of that is unconscious. The majority of people aren't thinking through all of the implications of what they believe or where they got these ideas from. The majority of people don't have to do that. It's not like there's a requirement for everyone to have a PhD in philosophy and think through these issues. But this is just the fact. This is the reality that we are living in. We all have these kinds of social imaginaries. We can't avoid that. So this other idea that Truman grabs onto from Taylor's book is the difference between mimesis and poiesis. So the mimetic view of the world, and these are not probably very common terms that are used today, but this idea is really helpful. The mimetic view of the world says that the world has a given order and meaning. And so there is meaning, there is purpose, there is in the world. We see this especially with the notion of teleology that is so prominent in ancient Greek philosophy, that is prominent in a Christian approach to the world, which is then lost with what we would call a mechanistic view of nature, this view of the world or the natural world, that there is no purpose in it. The world is just kind of this machine that just kind of operates because it does. There's no purpose in any of it. So then we have, in mimetic view, in your life, you discover meaning, you find it from an outside source, and then you have the responsibility to conform your life to what is true. You don't get to create that which is true or that which is good or that which is beautiful or moral. You have to be formed so that you can understand that which is external to the self. Then we have this poietic view, which says that the world is basically this raw material out of which the human meaning just grabs on and creates meaning for themselves. So in this poietic view, we take nature and we manipulate nature and we use nature for whatever ends that we desire to do so. Now, Truman makes the point, and I think this is really important, that this is just something in some ways that occurs because of our technological innovations that we have today. It's very different when you live in a kind of agrarian society. You are born within a singular community. You live in that community your entire life. I mean, if you look at the medieval writer, the Venerable Bede, wonderful commentator on scripture and historian as well, he never left his hometown in his entire life. Now, that seems absurd to us, but for a large part of the history of the world, yeah, you have nomadic groups and things like that, but there are a lot of times where, especially think about the medieval period, you're in a town, you have a place in that town, you have a job, you are, if you're doing agriculture, you are at the whims of nature. Like, you can't change whether it's going to rain, you can't change whether the sun is going to be out. You just have to work with what nature gives you. And it is what it is. And you're part of a community, you're part of a society, you have a role, you have to learn to live within it and figure it out. Well, I mean, today, the more technology has developed, the more globalization has happened, we feel like we are lords and masters over our own destinies. We feel like we are lords and masters over ourselves and over our world. Because we can travel from one place to another quickly, we can take a job, and if we don't feel satisfaction in that particular job, we can say, I'm going to leave and get a different job, move to a new city. And we don't have to think in terms of agriculture if we're not farming. And yeah, there are a lot of people who listen who are, farming, because that's what a lot of the, Lutherans in the Midwest do, who are a lot of my listeners. And, they understand that better than most people do. Because when you're not reliant on that, you're not reliant on nature. All you know is you go to the grocery store and you pick up food, it's there and you get it. You can kind of do what you want. And you can manipulate things however you want. You can manipulate your life circumstances however you want, because we have this notion of freedom. So it makes sense, because of the technological innovations, because of the cultural innovations, and because of the philosophical shifts that occur, that we think that it is up to us to create rather than to fit into the society that we are given. So meaning becomes something not that we extract from any external source, whether God or something else, or a place in our civilization, or a place in society, or economic class, or anything like that. We instead decide what meaning is, and we create it. Now, I would point largely to existentialism. I think existentialism plays a hugely significant role here. And existentialism has so profoundly impacted our literature and our movies and our theology within the church in a very bad way. So I've been extremely critical of existentialism. I think that's a large reason why we are where we are today, though not a sole reason. We are exactly where we are. So this mimetic and poietic view of the world comes through just our world circumstances, our life circumstances, but it also comes from some of the philosophical shifts and philosophical movements that are going on. Now, there are three aspects of Charles Taylor's thought that Carl Trueman identifies as really the kind of key things that we can grab onto here that he expands upon more. The first is that in our culture, we have a focus on inwardness, or our inner psychological life. And our inwardness, our inner psychological life, is decisive for who we think we are, for exactly who we are. So we think about who the self is internally. We think about the authentic self. Right? This is language that Heidegger uses, for example. It precedes him in some ways, and Truman's going to get at that. But Martin Heidegger, the existentialist philosopher, though he doesn't call himself an existentialist, so whatever you want to do with that. But he speaks about this kind of inauthentic existence that we live, and this inauthentic existence is our existence in just kind of the regular things of ordinary life. We just do what we're supposed to do, and we come to a point that we are to find our authentic selves, or create our authentic selves. We find authenticity in being who we really are. And not just doing whatever society determines that we're doing in our particular place and our particular expectation societally. So it's the idea that there is this authentic self that dwells internally rather than in our external behaviors and actions. And so in order to find our true selves, we need to look inward. So it's this psychological view of the self. Now, to be clear, it's not like past society has never understood that there is an internality in the self. I mean, this is what we're talking about when we speak about, for example, the soul. In large part, we are recognizing that there is this inner self that is more than just our physical stuff and our physical body. And we can certainly look at the writings of someone like Saint Augustine, who speaks about his inner psychological life. We certainly look at Martin Luther. There's plenty of psychological life going on there. But the psychological life by itself is not determinative of who one is apart from one's bodily experience and existence and place in broader society. This is especially true when you read Martin Luther, because there's a way to read Luther and I think misunderstand Luther through a kind of Freudian lens, a post-Freudian lens. And the fact that there are these kind of psychological studies of Luther certainly don't help. But so you look at Luther as this just internal individualist who was only concerned with his own psychological state, and faith is found internally. But Luther, I mean, if you read his writings on society, he was so clear on social structure. I mean, that was a huge theme in his thought, and vocation, and living your place in society, and recognizing others' positions in society, recognizing authority, and your place in the family. So Luther wasn't doing this to the kind of detriment of the external placement that you are in. And that's what you have really with the psychologizing of the self. And I'm pointing to Heidegger because he's one example of this that I spent a lot of time reading. But so what you have is this divorce between the bodily self and the place that one has in society and the inner psychological self. So it's not like there was no inner self before, but now you have this divorce where the true self is the inner self and the false self is that kind of external bodily pretense or where you are in society. So Truman speaks about that. He doesn't really deal a lot with Heidegger. I'm pulling in Heidegger because that's an author that I think is really key to this, that probably didn't have enough attention in this work. But I also recognize that it's impossible to cover all of this because there are so many factors. And that's what's really, really helpful, I think, about Truman's work on this is it's very easy to simplify the narrative of modernity. It's very easy to simplify the narrative of how we got to where we are and have kind of one scapegoat. And you see this with a lot of Roman Catholic polemics where they will blame the Reformation for everything, right? Or they will blame nominalism for everything. Now, I think nominalism is an important part of the story, and I wouldn't neglect nominalism. Truman doesn't really deal with nominalism. He doesn't go back that far back. I would say we've got to start there. I do think that there is a lot of important things happening in the late medieval period that lead to the Reformation, but also lead to some problematic areas as well with the rise of modern philosophy and then some assumptions that come later. So I do think nominalism is an important part of the story. But when we say, well, it's all nominalism, or it's all the Reformation, or it's all this, or it's all that, it's easy to just grab onto one thing and say that this is to blame. But that's just not the case. It's a complicated story. History is by its nature complicated. And when we speak about any historical shift or any historical event, there are multitudinous factors that result in that. And modernity is the result of a multitude of things going on. And that is ideologically, politically, culturally, technologically, all of these things play into where we are today. And also, it's important not to just say, therefore, everything that's happened is bad. It's not all bad. It's where we are. A lot of it is bad. And that's what we're going to be talking about. But what we can't do is say, therefore, anything after this age is bad, and we throw it away. I don't think that we can say, for example, because the nature of travel today and the development of technologies today, I don't think we can say because that has contributed to this false notion of the self and what I think is a harmful notion of the self, therefore all technologies are bad. No, it's a given. We live with it. There are good and bad things about it. We have to wrestle with the reality of what that means and the ethical implications of where we are and the ideological implications of where we are. But we can't just kind of throw it away. It's really not an option. We have the technology we have. The world is open in a way that it never was before. So let's wrestle with those ideas and how to deal with them faithfully and truthfully instead of just kind of shunning things. It's just not a helpful way to interact or deal with history. So there's the psychologizing of the self, and Taylor uses a particular phrase to refer to this, which he calls expressive individualism, which is that everyone finds meaning inwardly through discovering of inner feelings and inner desires. So the self is inner feelings and inner desires, and that shows who we really are. Now, certainly that's not going to really focus on what is the Augustinian notion that like our inner desires are largely sinful and they need to be like curbed. Our inner desires, we don't just say my inner desire is who I really am. We have to say, what are my inner desires and what is that which is true, good, and beautiful? Do my inner desires line up with what is true, good, and beautiful? Because if they don't, I got to curb those inner desires. And if they do, that line up with those things, then I feed those desires, because those are desires for that which is good. And Augustine speaks about the proper ordering of our desires, for example. A desire for self-preservation is good. Self-preservation is a good thing. It's not like we are called to just purely hate ourselves. We are called to hate ourselves, as Jesus talks about, meaning hate our sin and live. We also are to live for the sake of the other. So there is an inordinate love of self, which is I love myself above others. that's wrong, right? When I see my inner desire is to feed myself and do whatever it is that I want to do, and treat yourself, and all these phrases that are really popular in our culture today, that's not good. we Now, there is a good desire of self, which is you take care of yourself, right? You don't live in a way that you are harming your body, or that you don't rest your body ever. That is not a proper way to deal with yourself. But there is also an inordinate love of self, which is I love and care for my desires more than the desires of the other, or what my calling is that God has given me, or the divine law that God has revealed to me. Those things are much more important than my inner desires. And if my inner desires says I am more important than others, or I am more important than what God says is right and wrong, well, my desires are wrong. It doesn't mean, well, I need to live authentically with who I really am. No, it means I've got to change my desires. Really, God has to change my desires if we're talking about, things like regeneration. But it means that I shouldn't act according to those desires. So the conflation of moral goodness or authenticity with inner desire is not a good one. And the idea that authenticity is this ultimate moral good is really bad. Like it's not a moral, authenticity is not a moral good. And this is something that the church desperately needs to hear. Especially when there was the whole like emergent church thing, when this was popular, right? Everybody was talking about authenticity, and you need to be authentic, and everybody wants like pastors that are authentic, and you'd get like pastors going to the pulpit and being like, I'm terrible, listen to my sin. I heard a older man who was ordained and a professor confess a pornography addiction to a bunch of students. And that's completely inappropriate. It's completely inappropriate. And it was like, I'm being authentic with you, so let me tell you about my inner thoughts that are sinful and wrong, and my inner desires and sins. Like that's just inappropriate. Authenticity in and of itself is not a virtue. Their authenticity before God, yes. And scripture is very clear about that, right? If you look at the prophets, there is this, hypocrisy is bad, right? So hypocrisy is not good. And yes, you have these people, constantly the prophets like Isaiah, they're talking about the, worshiping with their lips, but their heart is far from me, this kind of stuff. That's sin. And God is calling people to don't just worship me with your lips, but actually have heartfelt, real repentance. That does not mean that authenticity is a virtue, right? Because if you're being more authentic because in your heart, you're really worshiping Baal, and you got to be authentic. So just go to the altar of Baal, just profess your faith in Baal and go worship. That's not what the prophets say is good to do, right? That authenticity is not good in every circumstance. Be authentic before God and confess your real sin. But it's not that, and this is the problem with the way that the church, because we've grabbed onto this expressive individualism idea, is we say external things are bad, right? We say that worship that is, liturgical is bad because it's according to a certain form and it's not heartfelt enough. As if that's what the Old Testament prophets are saying. That's not at all what the Old Testament prophets are doing. They're not saying don't be structured or formal in worship. What they're saying is do those things, because God, guess what, commanded all of the Old Testament worship in the form that it was in, but line up your heart with those things. So you see that the shift is there in the church as well, from these are good bodily actions, do with your body that which is good, and line your heart up with that, right? Line your desires up with that which is good. And that shifts then in especially when you saw with the emergent church, but you see in a lot of kind of progressive Christianity today, that, well, no, it's all about inner desires. And the church is this place where I express my inner desires and I'm authentic. We don't just need authenticity. We need virtue. What you do need, you need people that you can be real with and confess your sin to and your struggles with. And those people are there not to just be like, yeah, thanks for being real with me. No, those people are there to encourage you and help you walk along a virtuous path and call you to repentance. So this idea that we can all just kind of like, yeah, talk about our sin and we're being authentic and real. And this is absolutely what I find with radical Lutheranism, by the way, but that's another discussion. Um, it's sin and it's wrong. So that's not a virtue. So there's a lot that I have to say about this. That also has to do with, here's an example of this in society, and I'm going to be writing about this too in my section on beauty in this book that I'm working on. But this actually is true about how we dress, because the idea is in our society we have this, what is this conflation between the public person and the private person. Now, society has almost always understood that there's a difference between the self when you are in public and who you are in private. In other words, not that you're like two different selves, that's called hypocrisy, but there is a level of appropriateness in what you do socially and what you do internally or with your family, with your spouse. The way that you present yourself with your spouse should not be the way that you present yourself to the external world at your job. This is why we have informality in clothing. I mean, it just is, because what happened is we see, well, this is who I am at home. I can lounge around in my, t-shirt and sweatpants, and that's what I present to the world. I'm just being authentic. Now, it doesn't mean that the majority of people who go out dressed like that are thinking that. It doesn't mean, I'm not saying it's a sin to dress one way or another. That's missing the point. But what I'm saying is we do have to recognize that is at the root of the social consciousness we are all part of that leads to that. It would have been unheard of 100 years ago to go out to Walmart in your pajamas. It just would, and there's a reason for that. It's because of a societal shift, which is, yes, one of the reasons why I promote dressing up. I really enjoy it because I think it's fun. But I also do think that it is making a statement culturally as to where we are and the problems of where we are. Again, I'm not like calling anybody out for anything. This is the reality of what has happened. And there have been writings on this question as well, as to where that societal shift happened and how that affected clothing. So I'm not just like kind of bringing stuff out of nowhere. There are authors who have written on this, and Truman doesn't talk about that, but I'm just bringing in additional ideas. Okay, so we have this expressive individualism. Yeah, by the way, this is something that I also think is interesting, talking about, I know I'm going off the notes that I have here, but something also that I've been thinking through is the rise of subcultures. And what happens is this: we think that we need to be our expressive individual selves, and that's true authenticity. Now, at least when I was young, and I think things have shifted, because this is a whole other conversation as to what happened to subcultures, because I think there's the internet and other things that have shifted the way we think about this. But myself, like having been like a very big part of like the punk rock community, what happens is there is this social need of individuals to have a place in a social system, to have rules, to have conformity to something. And what happens is when you throw out what is just classical, say, Western culture, because that's where we are, when you throw out kind of classical rules, classical etiquette, classical ways of dressing and presenting yourselves to the world and social systems, we just create our own. And this is what subcultures are: is we're not made to be these individuals that just do whatever we want. We are made to fit into social units. And so what happens is you throw a bunch of people together and say, well, I'll just be individualists. What do? They go into groups and create their own identities together, right? This is what a subculture is. That's why it's the term subculture. So what happens in, say, punk rock, which is what I was part of, there's a way to dress. You have a place in that society. There's certain things you say. There's certain music you listen to. There's social shame. There is absolutely a hierarchy, because when you get the punk rock group together, the one who knows the most obscure bands and has been to the most shows and has the best, punk clothes, like they are higher on a social punk rock ladder. And the new guy who just got into, just heard the Dropkick Murphys for the first time, and is wearing that T-shirt, like, you kind of shame him because he's an initiate, he's new, and you call him a poser, and you've got to get over that, like, social initiation because you're a poser, because you like the kind of basic popular bands, and then you have to be initiated into the more obscure bands. So what you actually find is, and this is true of other subcultures as well, but the punk rock subculture ends up actually being its own social system. And you have your hierarchy. As much as the whole punk rock thing is getting rid of hierarchy, that doesn't work. You just create your own, because we're made to function as social units. So we create our own culture, and that's just what it is. And in some ways, I don't see that all as a bad thing either. And there's like the joke that everybody makes, like, oh, you want to be an individual, but you just want to be like everyone that's actually like you. Everyone who wants to be an individual looks the same, because you all go to, you think of like the, people that go to like Hot Topic and stuff, and they all kind of dress the same. They wear the same things, but talk about being different. Well, they are the same because they're joining a separate culture with a different group of people. So this is what you end up having when you don't have broader cultural norms. Is you have the high school groups, you have the jocks, and then you have the nerds, and then you have the whatever. Like, these groups break up, and they have their own rules. There's there is a hierarchy in your middle school and your high school, where there are the cool kids, the not cool kids. Everybody functions according to their own rules. We need structure. It's just what we do. So we can't avoid it. Now, what I think is happening now, which ends up being really dangerous, is because you don't have these kind of subcultures anymore. What you do have is, well, this focus on sexuality. And guess what? That becomes your subculture. So whatever your sexuality is, now that's your culture. Now those are your people. And when we see this with teenagers, it's extremely damaging. I think in the next 20 years, there's going to be just this huge fallout, because, there's going to be a huge fallout. It's inevitable. We're going to see the mess that we've put ourselves in, and we're going to have to seriously, as a society, evaluate what we've done and the damage that we've caused to people, and we can't just ignore it. It's already happening. These people talking about detransition, they are being censored largely. Nobody wants to hear from them. The social pressure that's there, it's really bad. So we can talk about that more in detail at another point. But so the other things that Taylor says here, that Truman says that Taylor brings up that are really important. The second is here, the affirmation of ordinary life that develops in the modern era. So we're talking about what develops in modernism. We could develop that a little more. And then the notion that nature provides us with an inner moral source. And this is going to be really, really key to the problem. And what I argue is that once we divorce truth, goodness, and beauty from one another, we have truth, which is pure scientism, right? Truth is found through the Enlightenment, purely in scientific experimentation and the material world and the ordinary workings of the material world. What happens then is, when there's nothing transcendent there backing that, as identified with truth, just that which is material, we no longer have a tie between that which is good and that which is true. And beauty, of course, doesn't matter at that point. So if that's the case, what happens is we have to find our ways to explain moral systems, because societies need morals to function. And ultimately, when you get rid of anything transcendent whatsoever, and you have the purely material, and science is the only way to find truth in any sense, then you are left without value judgments and without moral judgments as having any real inherent transcendent value whatsoever. So you're left with a bunch of options, of course, and you look at current moral theory from materialists, and they have different ways of dealing with things. You really can't establish an ought with a materialist framework. There's no such thing as an ought in a real sense. All you're left with is an is, because even if you're going to use evolutionary theories, the evolutionary model of morality, which is survival of the fittest, you can say, I know people bring up things like, hey, well, that leads to things like the Holocaust. And there really is a connection between evolutionary theory and then what became known as eugenics. and then that did play a role in things like that. The rise of Hitler in World War II, it did. Like there is a connection there. But to some degree, I think that when Christians grab onto that and say, well, Darwinian evolution leads to this morally, to some degree, I think they're missing the point, because the point is it doesn't establish anything morally. There is no inherent moral anything, because evolutionary theory, just to say that the survival of the fittest that's not a moral statement. All it is just a statement of what's the case. It doesn't mean it's right, because there is no right. I mean, it doesn't. If you're a pure materialist, there's no moral system behind that at all. It just is what it is. So it doesn't establish that we should do that, or that's the way things should be. It just is what it is. So what you're left with is different ways to kind of construct a moral system. And ultimately, when you've taken teleology, you've taken purpose out of things, you've certainly taken God's law, because you've denied the existence of God there. So there's no divine law. Well, what you're left with essentially is personal opinion and cultural norms. And that's what we're seeing today. It's just the inevitable fallout. This is what we're left with. We're left with, there's the inner self, what I decide is right, or there's just the cultural norms of what our culture happens to say, which could be right or could be wrong. It doesn't really matter. It's just what society says. So what we've done is come to this point of total internalizing of moral judgment. So we've said that moral judgment is just whatever is in me, what feels right, what I desire. So this idea of the inner moral self. Now, I'm at an hour, and I didn't get through nearly anything that I wanted to, but that's okay. I'll have to continue this later. I do want to hear your comments and questions on this as well. I know this is a lot of information. I'm kind of bouncing all over the place, because this is stuff that's just in my mind, and I just need to get it out, and I'm thinking through this so much. So I'd love to hear your comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these issues and questions that you may have, and where you'd like me to explore further as we look at this, because I do want to continue this. I want to go through the kind of major themes in Truman's book. I know I'm kind of making my own commentary as well, because I'm writing some things on some of these issues as well. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and maybe it's a little bit off topic for what we often talk about, but I do think it's important. So, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.